Hi there! Today I'm doing a little update on the different tools available on my store. I did a few upgrades on AL tools for Houdini Indie that can fundamentally change from the previous version. So that would deserve a little tutorial just so you won't get surprised when upgrading to this new version. If you bought those products either on ArtStation or Gumroad, those upgrades are available for you for free. So don't forget to check out your library and download the tools again. Okay, let's see what we have. We're gonna start with the AL-TerrainExporter. So we have this little terrain that I prepared for the demonstration, and I'm gonna create the AL-TerrainExporter, and we just want export different tiles of this terrain with the corresponding textures. So let's see, it's computing the different tiles. And yeah, that should be done. So we got different color that's corresponding to the different tiles with the corresponding UDIMs. So it's great. So far it's just converted mesh, and we'd like to reduce the topology. So we have this poly reduce. This doesn't change. Just a little reminder. So for the high res, I usually keep it around 35%, and just export terrain. So before, when you needed to export, you needed to isolate one tile per frame, but I automated this process, and now you can just click on export terrain. Just make sure that you have the proper path for your mesh, the name that is set properly for your asset, and yeah, that should be done. All right. I'm gonna trust that it's properly exported. Let's now export the texture. So we have this checker visualize height field. By default, I think in my erode I didn't export the bedrock, so I'm gonna replace it with something else. You can also find all the different layers into your erode node. So we have water, sediments, and so on. And I'm gonna grab the sediment. So that's cool, and instead of depth, I'm actually gonna export. So you can also find them from here. That's pretty handy. We don't have mask in this case, but probably the debris could be useful. All right. So from there, all we need to do is specify your resolution. Also, I actually like the values that I'm seeing. So in output range, I'm gonna set that to no remapping, just to make sure that what I see here will be what will be exported. So it's gonna take a bit of time, and hopefully this should export everything with the proper naming and the corresponding UDIMs. So let's check out the destination, see what we have. And yeah, we got the texture maps with the proper values. Kinda happy with that. So from here, I'm gonna load this terrain. So now in asset loader, we can just display high res. We didn't export the low res version of this guy. We probably could. So little reminder, you would basically set a lower percent and change the path to something else. Let's say low res, and export terrain. Boom, boom, boom. All right. So once it's exported, we should be able to visualize the low-res variant if we disable display high-res. And yeah, that's just a little reminder, this doesn't change. One thing that does change is that before, the terrain would reload at every frame, which is not very handy, but that is fixed by now. So let's move on to AL-MaskBuilder. So I already talked about this one into the Cliff tutorial. And you can basically create attributes, and in this case we can load these textures that we just exported, and it's gonna support the UDIMs, and it's gonna visualize the path and everything. And you can basically use the different values. In this case, you can extract the, let's say, the blue channel and mix that with something else, let's say the height, and it can help you drive some shading elements, scattering, all this kind of stuff. So that can be pretty handy. Right, so in this case, I'm storing all this operation with the maps and height into an attribute called mask. So it's the default name, and we're gonna use this attribute later to drive some scattering. So I'm dropping a null, let's call that output terrain, and we'll call this node when we will deal with the scattering. So I got a library of trees, and I'm probably gonna try to call them into our system. So I'm creating a geometry context with a sphere, and just gonna drop that here into the first input. So that would be our main surface. So let's just set that to a polygon with a proper size. Okay. And one of the changes with the AL-AdvancedScatter is now you got this checkbox. By default it's on, and it allows you to use the first input to drive the scattering. If you still need to object merge your surface because it's in another context, you still have that option, of course. In that case, it will ignore the input 1. And yeah, by default, visualize surface is not on. So yeah, for the demonstration, I'm probably gonna keep the input 1 for now, this basic sphere, just to show you some features. So we're gonna first call some geometries. So I'm gonna plug some trees. So note that we don't need to set any quotation marks now. It should run fine this way. And yeah, we got our different trees. So it's pretty heavy geometry, and it's represented as a box to make the display smoother and lighter. So also fix some stuff with use normal orientation, didn't always work properly. So maybe you could still rotate that if you want the trees to follow the shape. And if you don't want to display the box and actually force the display of all the instances, you can still go into the display option, keyboard D, and uncheck distance-based pack geometry. I wouldn't recommend it because it's gonna probably crash Houdini. So let's make sure that this is still on. And you can also probably optimize packed geometry. That can help. And yeah, from there, I'm actually going to increase the frequency. So we got better normals. And yeah, from there, what do we have? So we still have the classic feature. This doesn't change. You can vary the scale, the rotation, this kind of thing. So everything's working fine, even with the normals. I usually like to change the seed also. And yeah, now I'm just gonna drop some basic objects because, well, I realize using trees might be a bit too much for my computer. So let's instead use some basic geometry so that we can see the different shapes. So I'm gonna load this platonic and the box. Okay, so the size now is a bit too small. Let's increase that, and we see our platonic solid. So just to make it clear, we got this one that will be the red, that will be a blue color, and green. So that's how it should be represented. Okay, I'm gonna enable the height distribution, and well, pretty classic. We can drive this density, but also you can control the ID. So by dropping this slider to 0 and changing the curve, we are affecting the ID distribution based on the height. And this is how we control the distribution of the different shapes, and can always tweak this curve to adjust the placements. And we can also randomize things with the object ID override. So that can be a pretty handy way to control what type of vegetation is growing, let's say on the mountain, like can define the one that's in the bottom, in the middle, on the top, and so on and so on. So we also have an advanced mode, and this allows us to use a curve to drive which ID to override. So if I put that into the middle, we are replacing only the green one, and the more to the left we are going, we're gonna replace the blue ID. So like that, we are actually replacing only the blue ones. Right, so that can be a pretty handy way to really control the distribution. Sometimes you don't want to overthink it, of course, and just randomize stuff. So there are, of course, the simple mode, and there are also some other tricks I will show you. So one more thing is that we have this paint mask feature into the attribute tab. So let's use the handle tool or press enter on the keyboard. And if we left click, we can paint all geometries. So right now it's just affecting the density. And I think if we middle click, we should be able to erase. Yeah. Also, we got all those features from the attribute paint. And I'm actually going to reset the density, and let's disable the ID distribution of the height. And I'm going to use the ID control of this mask. So now whatever I'm painting is affecting the ID distribution. So that's can be pretty handy if you really need some specific geometries in some places. Like if I replace the FG float values, gonna replace either with the red one, the green, the blue, and so on and so on. So yeah, that can be pretty fun to play with if you really need to direct your result. One thing to note, the attribute needs to be called mask A in order to use the painting mode, otherwise it's back to a simple attribute calling thing. So I'm gonna use the mountain input I created and gonna disable a bunch of stuff and yeah, try to show you some other tricks. Right, so object to scatter, I'm gonna randomize things a little bit, add some of the box, yep. All right, so the scattering, we can basically call the attribute we created with MaskBuilder, so that's still an option. Also note that if you don't have the MaskBuilder, that's okay. You can still achieve the same result by using a map distribution. So can enable that, and let's use UDIMs, and same deal, let's make sure the path is correct and use a proper extension. So same like in the MaskBuilder, we can use the blue channel. You got the visualize RGB if you need to check out something. And yeah, we can mix that with other features like the height. Okay, so that's pretty much the same control. We just don't have the noise that's breaking up the height. So I'm gonna disable a bunch of stuff and let's see the curvature. So from now you have features that allow you to affect the scattering, the scale, the distribution based on the curvature. So that's a pretty handy feature in some cases. And one other thing is that we also have the occlusion. So this one is a bit slower, of course, because it's like casting rays and stuff. Well, can play with the max distance, raise, bias to get different result. So if you only need like scattering into the cavities or in contrary on the everything but the cavities, you can still do that. Let's visualize the surface. So yeah, it's getting some pretty clean results. And can of course mix that with other features like the height and others, maps or slopes or whatever you want. So I didn't talk about the scale, but it's still here and you can use it with any of the distribution features. In that case, it's the height, but it would work with any of the others. And let's move on. I'm gonna show you the cluster. So I don't think I talked too much about it yet. So what it does, it's creating a clusters attribute, and you can do a cluster randomly or by noise or by Voronoi. And we actually get this clusters vector attribute that we can call in our shaders to drive diffuse variation and so on. And one more thing, we got the clusters affect object ID. So this basically override the ID distribution that you did and replace it with the cluster attribute. So that can be a quick way to apply variations. Let's move on to the motion tab. So it's pretty new, and the only feature we have so far is just a frame offset to offset the animation of your different geometries, depending if you have one. We also have camera culling tab. So I'm going to use this scene as an example. So in this example, I'm using lines as a surface to scatter. To generate them, I'm going to do a quick breakdown. It's just importing my height field, which is a very basic slope kind of thing, and extracting the top face of the bounding box. From there, I'm applying divisions with a divide node and resampling those. All right, what do we have that's not doing anything? We have a point deform to control this kind of wave pattern. So I have this curve that is basically driving the amount of deformation I want. That's a pretty convenient way to bring some subtle variation. And then I'm using a ray node to project those lines back on the height field. So without, with, well, you get it, right? And the spacing is controlled by a resample. And yeah, I'm using that as a point template in my AL-AdvancedScatter. For the object to scatter, I created a procedural system to generate some kind of lavender. And yeah, we got quite a few polygons in there. It's all instanced though, so it's okay. It's running pretty fast. But instancing that might be a bit tricky for Houdini, so I converted it into a V-Ray proxy. So that's much more simple to instance, just a V-Ray proxy. And all right, let's set up the scattering system. So I'm dropping a geo context, lavender scatter, and dive inside. I'm gonna create the AL-AdvancedScatter, Poof. All right, we need an input, so I'm just gonna use the object merge and grab the output lines that I had. Let's visualize that, and let's disable scattering preview so we can see the points. And well, by default, you see that the spacing isn't great because, well, it's kind of random. So I'm rather using use object points to use the point template of my curves. So I'm gonna call my lavender cluster, and actually I'm gonna apply it onto object 2 and 3. And one little trick is that, well, first you can use the clusters to apply object ID real quick. Let's display that. All right, so if you only have one object with one animation cache, you can still just offset it to bring some kind of breakups in the animation. Right, now we could play with the size, of course, and all those stuff. I'm actually gonna apply some scale variation, some very small changes. All right. So I was talking about camera culling. So that can be a pretty cool way to optimize your scene. So let's enable that and grab the render cam. What it does is just trimming the selection of instance to the camera angle. So you can play with cull padding and back cull padding to make some kind of safety for the lighting. So we also have camera clipping. So that's a pretty neat way to isolate just whatever is in foreground or just what's in background if you need to run some tests. Yeah, like so. Can also play with the scale ramp, and I actually like to use it in this scene to make my lines thinner toward the background of my scene. So one more thing, now the preview tab is called display tab, and we have this pack and instance option. So I wouldn't advise to leave it off unless you have proxies like in here or just low-res geometries. And now by default the copying method is for each loop, which should be slightly faster. Now I'm gonna introduce some noise variation. So actually I don't want to influence the density, but only the scale. So I'm going to drop that. Yep, and increasing the roughness, stuff like that. And can also move the offset if you're not happy with the noise position. And that's pretty much it. One last thing, if we need to render that, maybe with Viri, we would need to leave the preview on. So, and the other way to instance would be to use the instancing context. I'm just pasting my network, and you would leave scattering preview disabled in that case. And all the geometry assignment is based on this instance attribute that the AL-AdvancedScatter is creating, that is linking to the object you assigned in object-to-scatter. So from there, you don't need to assign any instance object, and you can preview the point with enabling point instancing. But it's just a preview. You can leave it off and it would still work at the renders. Otherwise, you can still use the geocontext method, but make sure the preview is on and the back instance is enabled. So choosing one or another would really depend on the engine you're using sometimes, or depending on your scenes, what you are trying to do. For very large scene, I usually prefer using the instance context because more optimized in my opinion. But yeah, whatever works for you. So this is what I get so far. Still a lot of work. The character, of course, the lighting, shaders also is not quite there yet, but that's a good way to experiment new stuff, and I will eventually make some kind of tutorial for my Patreons about this one, so that should be a pretty fun exercise. As usual, if you learned something useful, please like and subscribe. That would mean a lot to me and will help the channel to reach more people in the pursuit of knowledge. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.